There we go. So really, without further ado, I'm going to start things off by sharing a little bit about the Stepping Stones project and why we are interested in hedgerows. So I've got a few slides, not very long. Can you all see that? And I have a few nods. Great, okay. So yeah, as I said before, I'm Charlie Bell. I'm Project Officer on the Stepping Stones project, which is a landscape scale nature conservation project in South Shropshire. And we have a 50-year vision. So we should probably talk about having a 43 or a 44-year vision, because we've been going for a few years now. But essentially, it's a long-term project. We hope to be around for a good few years. And this is our vision. It's all about habitat connectivity. So the first point there, for the natural habitats in the Shropshire Hills to be restored, healthy and connected. So that's the ecological part of our vision. The second part is focused on people. So it's about the people who live, work and visit this fantastic area to really understand what we're trying to do, appreciate it and to support our efforts. So if you're not familiar with the project, this is our project area. It covers around 200 square kilometres and it's in South Shropshire. So you can see up at the top of the screen there, we've got Pontesbury, and then we come out to the west and take in the Stretton Hills, down to the bottom of the Longmynd in the south, and then following the Welsh border around Corndon Hill. So that's really the core of the project area. We sometimes work a little bit across those boundaries, but this is where we focus our efforts. And one of the reasons that this is our project area is because we contain two core sites for nature. So shown in pink there, we've got the Longmynd. Many of you will be familiar with the Longmynd, I'm sure. An area of upland, predominantly owned by the National Trust and managed by the Trust and by the Longmynd Commoners Association. And then 5 miles across the Upper Onny Valley, we've got the Stiper Stones Triple SIN National Nature Reserve. And Stepping Stones is really all about helping to connect up this landscape and to connect up these two core sites for nature. And the reason for the project is really because over the many decades that nature conservation has been happening in this area, we've come to the conclusion that actually, although it's a fantastic network of nature reserves, it's inadequate for the needs of the many species and habitats that the area contains. And really the reason for that is because of landscape change. Again, I'm sure this is not new to any of you. I'm sure you'll be very familiar with this. But yeah, landscape change on quite a broad scale, leading to loss of habitats and more importantly, loss of connectivity of those habitats as well. So this quote here, which is taken from the Shropshire Flora, sums it up really. There appears to be an increasing polarisation between the conservation-rich areas and the conservation-poor areas, and an overall weakening of the ecological network. So this is the key issue for Stepping Stones really, and this is what, as a project, we're trying to address. And this picture here sums it up quite nicely really. In the middle of the picture, we've got a patch of quite connected land here. We've got decent hedgerows, we've got lots of trees, we've got small patches of woodland, and more of a mosaic of different habitats. Whereas surrounding that, we've got areas of sort of very heavy grazing, where many of those features has been lost, and very little value for wildlife. Last year we had this visualization done by Sarah Jameson, who many of you will know, to sort of illustrate what that connected landscape would look like. So on the left of the image here, we've got a sort of typical Shropshire Hills view. It's no one view in particular, but we hope it gives it a kind of general impression of the Shropshire Hills landscape. And on the left of the road, that's maybe the landscape, how it maybe is at the moment, or some of the less connected, ecologically poor parts of that landscape. Whereas on the right-hand side, that illustrates what that landscape would look like if the Stepping Stones vision was realised. So you can see it's still very much a farmed landscape. People are still very much present in that landscape, but it's much more connected and it's much richer in nature. We have various key habitats that we focus on as a project. I don't have time to go through them all, but one of the ones that we'll be interested in tonight is woodland. So it's about creating and restoring patches of woodland in the landscape, but really importantly, linking those patches together. And of course, the key feature that links patches of woodland are hedgerows, linear woodlands, essentially. So woodlands and hedgerows are a really, really important part of the work that we do as a project and the work that we hope to do in the future. Now, before I hand over to Megan, I just wanted to share this map. So this is the Stepping Stones project area, and it's essentially some work that Simon Cooter of Natural England, who many of you will know, did over lockdown. He looked at Google Map images and he classified all the hedgerows in the project area on a red, amber, green traffic light system. So the green hedges are intact hedgerows. They're still pretty decent in what he thought was a good condition, as far as he could judge from the aerial photographs anyway. The amber hedgerows are gappy, so they still exist. You know, the hedgerows are still there, but they're not in the best condition. There are gaps. The management is maybe not great, and those hedgerows are in danger of being lost. And you can see where this is going. The red hedgerows are, of course, those ghost hedgerows. They've been entirely lost from the landscape. They're still visible as sort of old lines of field boundaries, sometimes with a couple of veteran trees along the line of the old hedge. But those hedgerows as features have been lost. And you can see the figures up there. So the total hedge network within the Stepping Stones project area is 1,552 kilometres. That just blows my mind. It's a huge figure. And, you know, compared to some parts of the country, we're not bad. About 900 kilometres of that are still intact. But, you know, that does leave quite a lot that are gappy or that have been lost completely. Now, many of you will know that over the last planting season, I ran a lot of hedgerow planting sessions. We did an awful lot of volunteer hedge planting days. But despite all that effort, it's a drop in the ocean. We managed to restore over 4 kilometres of hedgerow, which sounds great. But when you look at it in the context of the map, you realise just how much more there is to go. So we're going to be busy for a good many winters to come, I think, turning those red hedgerows and those amber hedgerows back to green. On that note, I just wanted to finish with some hedgerow opportunities that are coming, hedgerow planting opportunities that are coming up this winter. If anyone wants to get involved and stick a spade in the ground and help us plant some hedgerow trees. So the work that I'm going to be doing is going to focus very much on a site called Barnes Farm. Now, this is just to the west of the Long Mynd. Those of you who are familiar with the area will see the Gliding Club up here. And if you drop off the Mynd by the Gliding Club, Barnes Farm is in the valley bottom. Now, this was acquired by the National Trust just over a year ago, and it's going to be managed, still farmed, but managed for nature. And we've got just over 2 kilometres of hedgerow restoration planned for Barnes Farm this winter. It's the top half of the site, so kind of the top half of this red area here is shown on the picture there. And you can see all those hedgerows that we're going to be restoring this winter. So if any of you fancy coming out, we've got some dates here. Don't worry about making a note of these now. I'm going to send a follow-up email to this webinar, and it'll include lots of links to things like these dates and how you can get involved and how you can sign up to those. So just to sort of make you aware really that they're coming. I also want to mention another organisation who we collaborate with very closely, CPRE Shropshire and their Hedgerow Heroes project. It's been running for a couple of seasons and they've got funding to carry that on this winter. And they've got 25 hedge planting days planned across Shropshire, so not just in the Stepping Stones area, but across a much wider area. 25 days between December and February. So if anyone's interested in getting involved with that, again, I'll share the link to that in the follow-up email. And this is just to show a sort of typical volunteer planting event. So if anyone's wondering what it looks like, there we go. We've got some volunteers putting a hedge in. at one of the sites last year. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing now and very shortly hand over to Megan. Megan's very happy to take questions at the end, and there's two ways that you can ask Megan questions. The first is by typing your question into the chat box. So if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should see a button that says chat. If you click that, then you'll get a box appear that you can type your question in. I'm going to keep an eye on that, and at the end of the session, when Megan's ready for questions, I can read out any of those questions that are in the box. If you don't want to do that and you would prefer to ask your question in person, then when we get to the end, you're very welcome to take yourself off mute and just sort of shout up and ask Megan the question directly. Okay, so I will hand over to Megan.
Brilliant, thank you. I'll just get my screen shared. Hopefully, oh, come on. Hopefully you can just see my slides and not my notes as well, Charlie. Fabulous, thank you. That's helpful. Right, so my name is Megan Gimber. And I work for a conservation charity called People's Trust for Endangered Species. And technically, I'm called the Key Habitats Officer there. But really, a better title for me would be Hedgerow Geek or Hedgerow Officer, because it's pretty much my main focus. I grew up on a farm in Devon, and I laid my first hedge when I was about 7. And I think that sort of explains why I'm such a hedgerow geek. It's a complete passion of mine. They are just a fantastic but overlooked habitat, and I really want to share what I know about hedges with anyone that will listen. If I get really excited when I'm talking about hedges, as sometimes I end up talking really quickly. So if I start speaking so fast that you can't hear me, do unmute yourself and shout at me, and I'll slow down a bit. So I think, sadly, I have to start with some context, and that's not some happy context, I'm afraid. We're facing a triple threat. We've got a biodiversity crisis, an environmental crisis, and a climate crisis. Last month, we had an update to the State of Nature report, and sadly, it doesn't make for pleasant reading. Pretty much all the graphs I still care about are moving in the wrong direction. And whilst I can't promise that hedges are going to single-handedly save us from any of this, they can be a really important tool in our toolkit. I'd call them low-hanging fruits even. So we have the capacity to help on so many fronts with hedges. They help, wildlife, our farming, and the environment. About 70% of the UK is agricultural land. So what we do within that is massively important to our native wildlife. This is the new graph showing the downhill trend for farmland bird indicator species between 1970 and 2021. So we've seen more than a 55% decline since 1970s. And whilst most of that happened in the sort of 70s and 80s, we're still seeing sort of a gentle decline. So a 5% decline since 2015 and 2020. So still something to be concerned about. And for context, 84% of these birds use hedgerows. So hedgerows are really very important to them. Similarly, we think we've lost about 51% of our dormouse population since the millennium, and a similar proportion of our rural hedgehog population as well. So 2 more species that really heavily rely on our hedgerow networks. So obviously there are several factors contributing to these declines. It's not just hedgerows, but given that these species, like many others, rely on a healthy, well-managed network of hedges, making sure we provide that can be an absolute lifeline for these species in their time of need. And what's more, I know this slide looks depressing, but it comes with a little bit of optimism. We can just tweak the way that we manage our existing hedge network, and we have the potential to see some really rapid positive change with little to no encroachment on the land area that feeds us. The infrastructure is mainly there. We've got over 400,000 kilometres of hedgerows nationwide, so the infrastructure is there, so we can have some rapid change with just a few tweaks in management. So this is why we're, as an endangered species charity, this is why we're involved in habitat work. Hedges are incredible for wildlife. George Eustace recently described them as the single most important ecological building block left in this country, and I completely agree. Very elegantly put, actually. One study done by the fantastic Robert Walton of the Devon Hedge Group. So he's a farmer down in Devon, and also a scientist and a hedge nerd like me. He looked at one hedgerow on his farm, an 85-meter stretch of hedge, and he basically looked at that for a couple of years, and counted all the species that he saw using it. And he counted 2,070 different species in that one hedge. And even this we think is an underestimate, because he says he was only counting species you could see with the naked eye. So really just mind-blowingly incredible for wildlife. And how do they do it? Well, for wildlife, hedges actually provide three main roles. The first component is a physical home. Species literally will live in hedgerows. So things like nesting birds, overwintering sites, hibernating hedgehogs, dormice, small mammals, bumblebees, all sorts of things will physically live in a hedgerow as a home habitat. Secondly, what we call a complementary habitat. So things that might not necessarily directly nest or hibernate in hedges still use hedges, still rely on them. This can be for food, whether that's berries or small mammals, or it can be shelter. So shelter from the elements or shelter from predators. It might even be sort of important behaviors that animals need to display throughout their life cycle, whether that be, you know, meeting mates or defending territories. So birds are a good example. They use hedgerow trees as posts from which to sing. Barn owls hunt alongside hedgerows because that's where you get lots of lovely small mammals. In fact, of the 84% of those farmland bird indicator species that use hedges, only half of them use them as a physical home. The rest rely on them for this sort of complementary habitat, for the food and for the shelter. And thirdly, and importantly, hedges are wildlife corridors. So this helps connect populations that might otherwise be isolated and vulnerable. So these corridors allow species such as bats, butterflies, and moths to navigate around the countryside. They allow other species like dormice to move between remnant patches of habitat, thereby connecting populations that would otherwise be isolated from one another. Some species use hedges for all three of these functions. Bats are a good example of this. I was once told that bats need three things to thrive in a habitat: a roosting site, a safe commute, and insects to feed on. And hedges and hedgerow trees can provide all three. Bats can roost in hedgerow trees. They will feast on the biomass of insects that hedgerows provide. And they also provide connectivity, because bats like to echolocate and use hedges to sort of locate themselves around the countryside. On top of this as well, you know, when they're out feeding on the insects, if you've got a stormy, wet winter's night, those insects won't be out flying unless they've got some sort of shelter. So actually, when you've got that sort of inclemental weather, it's really important to make sure that the food stuff for bats is actually out and flying. Similarly, hedgehogs use it for all three features as well. They will hibernate at the bottom of hedges. They feed on invertebrates at the hedge margins. And hedgehogs actually like to navigate the landscape with they like to sort of bimble along linear features, and hedges are a perfect example of that, because they can also shelter in the bottom of them when needed. And lastly, for these examples, dormice are another great example, using hedges as home, food, and corridors. We sort of tend to think of dormice as a coppice woodland species, but actually good hedges are capable of sustaining breeding populations of dormice. But to do this, they need to be particularly good hedges. Dormice eat a variety of foods, and that changes throughout the year. At the beginning of the year, they might eat flowers, blackthorn flowers. Then they move on to things like aphids, to blackberries, to ash keys, then to hazelnuts. So what they need changes throughout the year, which means if they're going to live in a hedgerow habitat, they need all those things present. And of course, Dormice are what we call arboreal creatures, and this means they travel across the branches. They don't like to travel across the ground. So the safest way for them to cross our countryside is through hedgerows. So as part of the dormouse conservation work that we do as a charity, we reintroduce dormice populations to areas of the country where they have recently been lost. But before we do this, we need to make sure that these populations aren't going to be isolated, and that actually they have good connectivity to other populations. So as to how and why a man-made habitat is this good for wildlife, I think this is fairly complicated, but I think this is fascinating. The short version is that hedgerows mimic the rich habitat that you find at a woodland edge. So for hedges, we have overlapping elements of woodland, flowering scrub, and grassland. And this is what makes up that woodland edge ecotone. So it doesn't replicate any of these habitats fully, but it means it's capable of supporting species from each of them. Like hedges support 80% of what we would normally call woodland bird species. For some species, it's even better than the sum of its parts, because there are some species that actually need all of those elements to be there for them to really thrive in a habitat. So a song thrush is a good example for this. It will sing from hedgerow trees. It will nest in the dense hedge structure, the sort of flowering scrub element of it. It will feed on snails and worms from the hedge base, especially if you've got a good wet ditch down there. And then it will move on to hedge berries later on in the year. So just one of those species that will actually depend on all of those elements being there and healthy. Similarly to dormice, that they'll feed in the flowering, fruiting scrub, but also from ash keys from the trees. They actually weave their breeding nests in the protection of the scrubby structure, but their winter hibernation nests in the tussocky grass at the hedge base and hedge margin. Brown hair-streaked butterflies are another great hedge example. They lay their eggs on young blackthorn stems. They use the sheltered side, the leeward side of a hedge, to gain the body temperature to fly. And actually they congregate around large, prominent hedgerow trees to mate. So again, they need all of those features there. And when it comes to it, the closer you look at our native ecology, the more species you'll find actually thrive in this woodland edge, this combination of features. Even many things that are classified as woodland species, if you go into a wood to go and find them, you'll tend to find them in the glades, in the rides, in the edges, where you've got more of this wonderful combination of features. And the reason is basically, this is essentially mimicking what we think we will have had in pre-agricultural wildwood. We would have had patches of woodland, but we would have also had patches of glades, areas of scrub, scattered trees, and pasture. And this would have been kept open by migrating large herbivores, megafauna, that would be sort of crashing and crunching and browsing and moving around the countryside. So we wouldn't have had, a sharp dividing line between woodland and pasture. We would have actually had much more of this woodland edge ecotone. And this mosaic of habitats would be constantly shifting over time as the herbivores moved between different areas. So again, it was this dynamic habitat edge that much of our wildlife will have adapted to, perhaps explaining why things like hedgerows and other cultural habitats like traditional orchards and wood pasture are so rich in wildlife. So for hedges, what we've just done is we've just sort of squeezed all this amazing habitat into narrow corridors. So we might have lost some of the spatial dynamism. We can't, let our hedges continually sort of move into our fields. We do obviously need to farm and to eat, but actually we can keep some of this wonderful structural dynamism through time by managing hedgerows on a life cycle. We can keep hedges at this valuable stage of succession through changing how we manage them, and conveniently, this way of managing them isn't a new thing, but actually what we've been doing for centuries. We knew what we were doing. It's managing hedgerows according to their life cycle. We reset the hedge succession when they mature out of this Goldilocks stage of growth, and we end up creating a habitat that's both useful to us, but also ecological dynamite for wildlife. So in this way, our network of hedges crisscrossing over the countryside provide these main roles for wildlife: home, food, shelter, and connectivity through their woodland, flowering scrub, and pasture elements. And we can use this knowledge to help guide our management. All our management decisions when we come to hedges can be improved at a landscape level by considering how they'll affect not just the structures of the hedge, but also how these hedges are functioning for wildlife. So on that note, I'll start speaking about what we think the structure of a good hedge looks like. So for wildlife, we think a good hedge tends to have a mix of different plant species. So hedges with more plants in them have a higher diversity of invertebrates and higher diversity of birds. And partly this is because each plant has some thing or other that will specialize on feeding on it. But it also tends to mean that you get a better year-round availability of food sources because they all flower and fruit at slightly different times. Next up, we want decent height and width to our hedges. Generally, increasing the height and the width of a hedge tends to increase the diversity and abundance of wildlife within it. And that's not just because you've got more habitat, but actually it's also because it creates more complexity within the hedgerow network. Unfortunately, I can't give you what the perfect size of a hedgerow is. That's an impossible question to answer, because hedges do need to keep moving through their life cycle. We can't keep them to one shape and size, even if that's a particularly good one. So when I'm asked, well, what's the perfect size for a hedge to be, I generally have to just say bigger than it was the year before, or bigger on average, but also within its life cycle. Next up, we want structural complexity. So some species like the thrush needed several hedge features within one hedge throughout their life cycle. But actually you can take that a step further as well. And given that different species have slightly different needs from a hedge, ideally we want to see many different structures represented across the landscape at any one time. We want some short, tight, clipped hedges, some big billowy ones, because actually having that diversity of structures gives us the best opportunity for our wildlife. Next, we want good connectivity, and this is so important. So we want to see hedges that are really good at connecting up other habitats, copses, woodlands, ponds, rivers, all sorts of things. This connectivity is really valuable for. But also we want connectivity within the hedge itself. So we don't want to see what we've got on the left-hand side here, which is hedges that are getting increasingly gappy. Next up, we want to see a good margin at the base of a hedge, and this is really important. Not only is the margin amazing for things, for foraging and nesting birds, for small animals, insects. In fact, over 40% of the priority species that depend on hedgerows utilize the margins. But actually, it's really important to help protect the hedge itself. If we ploughed right up close to the base of the hedge, we're going to be disrupting the roots of the shrubs and the trees. And, they might tolerate that for a short time, but it's going to weaken them, which means at the next drought, at the next flood, whatever next disease comes along, that it might be the straw that broke the camel's back. So actually maintaining these margins is important, not just for the wildlife, but for the future of the hedge itself. Next up, we want to see good hedge density all the way to the ground. We don't want these leggy hedges. And this is really important for wildlife, really very important for wildlife. We want that leafy, branchy growth to extend right the way to the ground, because it's that basal growth that's so important, shelter for things like ground nesting birds and for hedgehogs. And actually there's loads of species that nest in hedges, that nest at knee height. So if your hedge doesn't have a knee height, then it's not quite so good as a habitat. This actually, the base of a hedge, the reasons why they might be getting leggy is many different reasons. So over trimming is one, and the top left picture is a hedge that's leggy because it's been over trimmed. But you can also get this same sort of shape when they've been grazed. Particularly sheep do this. The bottom left picture, that hedge has just been undergrazed by sheep. And actually they can lose this base growth if they become over tall and over mature as well. They end up shading out the sort of leafy branchy growth at the bottom, and this actually acts as a really good indicator as to when a hedge might need rejuvenation. Whenever you see this sort of leggy appearance of a hedge, then it's often a sign that that hedge might need some action, whether it be laying or coppicing. And lastly, but very much not least, for hedgerow structure, we talk about hedgerow trees. So over half of the priority species associated with hedges are dependent on hedgerow trees. They provide songposts, territory markers, nesting opportunities for birds, bats, more insects, all sorts. But also, in a year where a hedge has been cut, it's not going to flower or fruit, but the hedgerow trees up above will do. So it also adds an element of a buffer, food buffer for our wildlife. Old hedge trees, especially old pollard trees that you might find in ancient hedges or boundary hedges, provide really valuable deadwood for all our really rare deadwood dependent species. We've got about 2,000 deadwood dependent insects in this country, and at least 320 of those species are known pollinators. So they are a really important group, even though they're a group we don't know a huge amount about. All of these beautiful pollard trees in this slide, they're all within walking distance of my house down in Devon. We are particularly blessed with good hedge pollards. But sadly, we've lost a huge number of hedgerow trees. We lost loads to Dutch elm disease. We're about to lose more to ash dieback, which is the most common hedgerow tree. And we're not establishing enough new trees to accommodate these losses. So this slide, I think, is my last depressing slide. I hope it is. The section of map on the left is an old 1880s map. And on the right is what that same area of land looks like now. So we've lost a couple of hedges. But I think what's more striking is how many hedgerow trees we've lost. And those are those sort of individual blobs on the left-hand side. And we've lost almost all of them. We've only got about 5 trees left on the right-hand side. So it's quite striking how many hedgerow trees we have lost. And to be honest, in a time where tree planting is all the rage, I would say establishing trees in hedges is a complete no-brainer. It doesn't take any more land out of production, so we can still grow lots of food. They form what we call open grown trees, which are fantastic for wildlife and have a longer lifespan than those grown under closed campy woodland. You can manage them as well, so they can be useful trees, useful for timber, wood fuel, additional crop production. You can coppice them, pollard them, leave them as standards. We can diversify the trees as well, so they can help add more species to our hedgerows. And actually, we can establish them for free as well through natural regeneration. So you can either tag suitable young candidates and spare them from the trim, or you can leave a couple of good stems standing when you next lay or coppice the hedge. And that's what this slide shows. It's a fantastic farmer who lays all of his hedges on rotation. And each time he lays a hedge, he chooses a couple of young hedgerow trees to stay standing and make new hedgerow trees. So doing it this way, rather than planting them, actually has some added benefits. It means you're preserving the genetic diversity present in your local tree populations. And this is so important. The genetic diversity of our tree populations is basically their biggest defense against threats. So some trees might have genes in them that make them more drought tolerant or more flood tolerant, or maybe resistant to whatever new tree disease might be on the horizon. So actually making sure we maintain all of this genetic diversity, I think, is really crucial. But of course, you can plant hedge trees as well. You don't have to get them through natural regen. And call me an optimist, but whenever I see a gap in a hedge, I always think it's a great place to plant a new hedgerow tree. And again, can be a really great way of diversifying what might otherwise be a species poor hedge. So this example here, this is a hawthorn enclosure hedge, getting particularly thin and gappy. I would definitely plant some trees in this hedgerow, as well as doing a bit of TLC. But the origin stories of a hedge, I mentioned enclosure hedgerows. Where that hedge came from has a massive impact on the wildlife that you might expect to find in it. Not all hedges were born equal. There are estimates that put some of the Cornish hedges up to about 5,000 years old. Dartmoor has Bronze Age hedge features. We've got maps that show individual named hedges in the same place for almost 1,000 years. In Devon, down where I am, 2/3 of our hedges are medieval or older. So huge history to some of these hedges. In fact, some of our hedges, what we call assart hedges, come from when we cleared the original pre-agricultural wildwood. We would leave strips of wildwood and create hedgerows out of those when we cleared the fields in the centre. So really, it's not much surprise that hedges like this are absolutely chock full of ancient woodland indicator species, full of plants, full of fungi, and home to a huge proportion of the genetic diversity of our tree and shrubland population. They are thoroughly ancient, some more ancient than some of our ancient woodlands, and certainly need to be considered equal on that front. But I'm often told that hedges have lost their function. People tell me that wire fences are now cheaper and easier way to control livestock. But to me, this ignores all the other practical on-farm and environmental benefits that hedges bring us. I would say that stock-proof fencing is not and has never been their only value. So it's obviously not just wildlife that hedgerows benefit. They've got loads of values. I think I'll run through this really quickly, but if you are interested in the wider values of hedgerows, we've got this poster on our website, and it's got a whole page explaining what I mean by it all. But I will run through very quickly. So let's start with livestock. Hedges provide really valuable shelter. They also provide really valuable shade, and both of these things are going to be increasingly important, really important for our high animal welfare standards, as well as for rearing sort of healthy, profitable livestock. Dairy cows in particular need the shade. They start getting heat stressed about 23 degrees Celsius, and above that things start to go downhill for them. You know, their milk yield will be lowered, their immune system will be compromised, their fertility will be lowered, their weight gains will be reduced. So really, you know, hugely important. If you're not interested in livestock, then hedges are also fantastic. If you've got crops, they create a semi-permeable barrier, which takes the strength out of winds, which reduces crop lodging and things like that, without creating all the turbulence on a leeward side that a solid barrier would. So really very clever. They might help us reduce pesticide use. And they do this by increasing the populations of beneficial insects, so predatory spiders, ground beetles, parasitic wasps, hoverflies, all things that can control the crop pest species. And it might not stop them completely, but it might prevent their populations getting out of control. They're also really important to support a diverse population of pollinators. They offer pollination forage, or flowers, essentially, throughout the year, not just when our crops happen to be flowering. And they also happen to provide areas of uncropped land, which is essential for pollinator overwintering. So obviously pollinators need food, but they need somewhere to live as well, and they don't live very well in cropped land. Hedges provide all the habitats that they need to actually make their nests and survive. Next up, hedges can help reduce soil erosion. They can play an important role in times of flood because they increase the rate at which water infiltrates into the soil. This helps the soil basically act like a sponge to soak up flood water rather than allowing it to run off the surface. And in this way, they can also reduce the amount of pollutants and silt that actually reach our streams and rivers from our farmland. They can soak up pollution, so air pollution, noise pollution, the sediments in field runoff. And of course, they also soak up carbon. So they store carbon in the woody stuff above the ground, in their roots below the ground. Surprising amount gets stored in the roots. Also in the soil around the roots. And actually, from the planting of a hedge, it can be 50 years of gradual soil carbon accumulated in the soil around that hedgerow. So again, really important, as well as in the hedgerow trees as well. The IPCC, the Interparliamentary Panel, I think, for climate change, recently recommended that we increase hedges by 40%. CPRE had a campaign calling for the same figure. And the NFUs also highlighted how valuable hedges will be in hitting their target of net zero by 2040. DEFRA have responded by giving a target of, I think, 45,000 miles of new hedges by 2050. So absolutely, fantastic stuff if we can get these into the ground. So how do we manage hedges? Obviously, how we manage hedges affects the health of the hedge, their structure, their shape, and has a massive impact on their capacity to sustain wildlife, but also their capacity to act as effective wildlife corridors. This level of fragmentation shown here makes it impossible for animals such as the dormouse to use this hedge for any of their three main uses. This isn't providing blossom or berries, it's not providing home, it's not providing shelter, it's not providing corridors. And to be frank, it's not actually doing very much for us as land managers either. It doesn't have any of those inherent benefits that we need. We went through a few dark decades where there was incentivized hedgerow. The government literally paid farmers to take hedgerows out. And we think we lost up to about 50%. But I'm glad to say that is out, like the outright removal is pretty much behind us, especially in the agricultural sector. We do still see quite a lot of hedge loss in developments sector. But now actually there are being so many more hedges planted than ever. It's fantastic, I think. This graph here shows a recent uptick in hedge planting in the last couple of years. I think it's a really impressively shaped graph. And I get a huge amount of optimism from this slide. So this is the last two columns on this graph. They are 2021 and 2022, and just how much planting took place in those 2 years dwarfs what was done in the previous decade. So really very exciting on that front. But it is worth remembering, with all these new hedges going in, that what we have now shouldn't really be considered a baseline, given how much we've lost, but also that new hedges don't adequately replace the value of old ones. And given the historic loss, it's more important that the remaining hedges, our old hedges, our ancient hedges, are kept as healthy as possible. But sadly, we do still risk losing many of our hedges, no longer because we're physically taking them out and ripping them up, but actually largely now through the way we're managing them. The last countryside survey showed that only 31% of our hedges were in good structural condition with appropriately managed margins. And actually this drops down to about 10 or 12% in purely arable land. So a lot of the cases, this was actually a result of hedges no longer being managed according to their inherent life cycle. So how do we manage for healthy hedges? What do we think healthy hedge management looks like? First of all, they do require management. If we don't manage them, they turn into a line of trees. So without trimming, the species in our hedge have this natural tendency to just grow upwards, eventually becoming tree lines. I mean, this is actually sped up through the fact that they're planted so close together, so they compete with each other for light. Now, a line of trees doesn't sound like a bad thing, but actually, as everything competes and races upwards for light, you end up losing that thick, dense structure at the base that's so good for and valuable for wildlife. Many of the trees will eventually topple. If you've got a mixed species hedge, you'll often lose the flowering scrub elements because they can't compete. They're not very shade tolerant. And you end up getting this sort of increasingly gappy line of trees as they do eventually topple. So a line of trees isn't a long-term feature in the landscape, not like a hedgerow can be. So how does trimming affect a hedge? So trimming a hedge changes the balance in hormones in the hedgerow plants. So cutting off the growing tips takes out the hormone that encourages them to race to the sky, and actually means they put more effort into branching growth instead. So taking out a couple of those top buds means that the ones further down spring into action and you get much more branching structure. And we can utilize this response to create a dense hedge that's great shelter and great nesting habitat by actually lightly trimming hedges higher and wider at each cut. So hedge cutting can be a really valuable tool in our toolbox for good hedge management, but we need to do it well. So I'll start on from the beginning. If you've got a newly planted hedge, I would say there are 3 really good ways of establishing a good hedge from that. So normally we plant between 5 and 6 what we call whips, little plants per meter, and we do that in a double staggered row. That's sort of a conventional way of planting. But what do we do from there? That's just planting a hedge. There's more to hedge establishment than just the planting. So option 1 is to leave our hedge to grow for 10 years. 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 7 years, depends on how quickly they grow and when we get around to it. And then we lay the hedge. This is fantastic because when you get regrowth from a laid hedge, it turns each stem into a multi-stemmed bush. So we might have planted 5 whips to the meter, but we end up getting 25 to the meter because each stem has turned into maybe 4 or 5. It also means that we actually have to take off those plastic spiral guards, which is really very valuable because, you know, if you're not laying the hedge, then there's never a good time to get those spiral guards off. And it's what we call a spiral shadow at the base of a hedge. You end up getting sort of 50, 70 centimeters of the hedge base where it doesn't have any branching. This sets that right and means you get branching, dense growth all the way to the ground with this method. Once you've laid the hedge, the regrowth just needs to be trimmed slightly higher, slightly wider each year to establish a really fantastic dense hedge. This is gold star management. This is my favorite recommended management. Option 2, you can do exactly the same but coppice instead of lay. And option 3 is you incremental trim from the start. So you've got your whips, you let them grow. The first winter you chop them. Second winter you chop them slightly higher and slightly wider, slightly higher and slightly wider, slightly higher, slightly wider, until you've got a fantastic, well-established hedge. This creates a really good, dense hedge because it encourages branching growth from those lateral branches. What it doesn't do is get rid of that 70 centimeters at the bottom where you don't have any branches. And what it doesn't do is multiply that stem density. So you've still sort of got your 5 or 6 whips per meter. But again, a reasonable way of establishing a hedge. What we don't want to see and what we think should be avoided is letting a hedge grow to the height that you want it and then just cutting it at the same height repeatedly. This basically means all of the growth is encouraged to come just below where it's cut, and you end up getting a sort of top heavy, hollow bottomed hedge. And after a while this stresses out the plant because it's not getting enough growth. It's all at the top where it gets trimmed off. And you end up losing stems and it starts to get thin and a bit feeble. I've seen hedges look really thin and feeble after just 20 years of this management, and really they should be in their prime by then. So this is how we would recommend not establishing a hedge. So once you've established your hedge, how do you manage it from there? Now, I would say not cutting every single year is a first rule, and not cutting to the same height is a second, because when you cut to the same height and do it every single year, you end up doing some real damage. This is what leads to what I would call chronic over trimming. So this reduces the structure of the hedge. It gets a bit leggy, you end up losing stems, and to begin with, the rest of the hedge plants almost kind of stretch to try and fill those gaps. But you know, the more hedge plants that you lose, the more difficult this becomes, and you end up getting a sort of gappy hedge. And in this way, hedges are literally fading from the countryside through this sort of static management of annual trimming to the same height. Luckily, this is completely avoidable. And there's a few things that we can do, really minor tweaks that actually make the picture a lot better. Now, one of them, if your hedge management does involve trimming, then knowing that most of our hedge plants blossom and fruit on second year wood and older gives us two trimming options. Firstly, longer trimming rotations. So the example shown here is from a chap called Martin Lines of the Nature Friendly Farming Network. And I think this elegantly shows how well a 3-year trimming rotation impacts the blossom of a hawthorn hedge. That picture in the middle, that's the 3rd year, and you can see just how much more blossom it's got than the other two. Now, of course, when you trim a hedge that's been let to grow out on a 3-year rotation, it looks a lot more harsh. You know, you get a bit more splinters, and you've had to trim through thicker stems. And I often get shown pictures of hedges that have been trimmed, and people think that they've been completely brutalized. But what I see is someone that's managing their hedge on a longer trimming rotation. So you do end up going through thicker wood, and it does look much more messy. But on balance, actually, this creates a better habitat, more flowers, more fruit. And of course, with that increase in blossom comes an increase of fruit. So even if you have a hugely diverse mixed species hedge, if it's trimmed to the same point every year, you cut off most of that fruiting and flowering potential. The other option, other than long trimming rotations, is actually what we call incremental trimming. And this is just cutting slightly higher and slightly wider at each trim. This is a really simple management tweak, but actually what it means is you keep a border of young wood around the edge of your hedge. So you will always have flowers and you will always have fruit, even on cutting years. You end up getting a really thick, dense hedge. It looks tidy as well, if that's important to you, if that's your aesthetic. And you actually avoid the structural damage. You don't end up getting that sort of knuckle of scar tissue that builds up at a static trim line. But for me, the biggest advantage of adopting this method is that hedges that might otherwise be in a static trimming regime naturally grow and start moving through their life cycle. So the results, I think, speak for themselves. This hedge is trimmed every year, slightly higher, slightly wider. It looks absolutely stunning. Then sometimes we might, it's best to do nothing for a while. We can let our hedges grow out, get a bit big, get a bit blousy, and just put them into what we call a period of non-intervention. But at the end of the day, no matter how well you manage your hedge, it will always need rejuvenation. So this could be hedge laying, or it could be coppicing. And essentially, it resets that hedge cycle. It thickens it back up from the base. And from here, you can start that whole successional process again. So it resets that succession, giving it a fresh start. And actually, the regrowth that you get from hedge laying or from hedge coppicing, that regrowth right from the base, actually gives your hedge another life cycle. So it turns what would have otherwise been, a limited life into something that can actually live forever. So I think it's incredible to think that the reason we've got so many ancient hedges is actually thanks to an unbroken chain of care, management, and rejuvenation over the many centuries that they've been there. And this is essentially what makes them immortal. It's the skills and the management passed from farmer to farmer, hedge layer to hedge layer, from generation to generation. And it's crucial to understand that hedges will only survive if we offer them the similar management going forward. So put all that together, and this is what you get. This is the hedgerow management cycle. Hedges are best managed on this cycle. It looks a bit confusing, but once you dig into it, it's quite simple. What I find really optimistic about this, so this is based on work from Nigel Adams of the National Hedge Laying Society, who's an absolute hedgerow legend. He's brilliant. But what this to me shows, those pink boxes and those purple arrows show that pretty much wherever you are in your hedge life cycle, pretty much whatever structure, shape, or condition your hedge is in, there is something that you can do about it. There's some way of bringing it back into that nice, dense, and well-managed cycle. And there's lots of clues that hedges give us if we learn to speak their language, that they're in need of a change of management. This is a few images, but I've made a whole library of them on our website called Reading Hedges that help you understand these little tricks as indicators, basically indicators of a need of change. So I will quickly wrap this up, but what I'll say in the meantime is that we've created 2 hedgerow surveys that we think help on hedgerow conservation. One, which is the Great British Hedgerow Survey. This is aimed at volunteer groups, wildlife groups, parish groups. You do it in the summer months where you can see the different species. It takes about 20 minutes per hedge to do. And when you add this to the website, the data, each one gets immediate and tailored feedback, not only about the health of the hedge that you just surveyed, including a blow for blow account of where you might have lost points, but it also gives management advice based on the hedge management cycle and where we think that hedge is within it. That's the survey form. That's what it comes back with. And this is us out doing it in the field. We surveyed all the hedges on our nature reserve. This one said it needs to, this correctly recognized this one needed rejuvenation. So we had a team of volunteers go out and lay it, and this was what it was like 2 growing seasons later. It's looking absolutely fantastic now. We've given it now its first trim to thicken it up and really encourage that branching structure. We used the opportunity to increase the number of hedgerow trees in it as well, and now it's looking absolutely glorious. There's plenty of resources on our website if you want to have a look at them, from photo galleries describing, what you're looking at when you look at particular hedge structures, to understanding different elements of a hedge, so you can sort of read how it's doing and what management it's seeing. And the second one we've actually developed specifically for farmers. So this is an app that we created. It's completely free. It's called Healthy Hedgerows, and it's a rapid assessment app. So you do this in the winter time when the hedgerows are bare of leaves, and that's where you can better see the structure. And it's basically just 6 questions. And once you've done that, it gives you management advice at the end of it. So the 6 questions are all fairly easy as well. You basically choose what structure it looks like from the different structural options. This ties it into that life cycle approach, but you also estimate height, width, gap length, number of trees, and the base canopy. So quite a simple task. And this then puts all of the results on a map and color codes it. And this basically helps understand how we can change our hedgerow management plans. It's easy enough to manage a hedge one by one, but actually when you step back and you've got a whole farm or a whole landscape to do, it becomes much more of a challenge. And there's considerations at the landscape scale that you can only see once you understand how these things connect. For example, if you're going to rejuvenate a hedge, you need to understand whether the hedges around it are capable of supporting the nesting, the food, and the connectivity that will be lost for a season or 2 when that happens. So this is a fantastic way for farmers and anyone managing hedges at a landscape scale to really assess how they make their management plans going forward. I'd say there's an old adage that says you can't improve what you're not measuring. So these surveys are designed to improve hedges one by one by demystifying hedgerow management and offering that bespoke management advice. So ultimately, what do we want to see? I want to see hedges bigger, better, and more joined up. I want to see them fulfilling their ecological and environmental potential. I see far too many wasted hedges, and with a few tweaks, they could be providing so much more on so many levels. I'd love to see them managed on a life cycle, including rejuvenation, and this would lead to fewer gaps and hopefully more hedgerow trees. I always like to end a talk on this poster. You won't be able to see much of the detail on your screen, but the poster is available on the website if you do want to see more of it. But it shows the long and exciting history of our hedges. I think the future looks good for hedgerows. They've been with us in some form or another since the Bronze Age, and they've weathered some pretty turbulent times already. They're fairly robust. Last century wasn't the first time, and I'm sure it won't be the last, that politics has had a big impact on our hedges. Hedges have seen enclosures and riots and uprisings. Their history is almost as fascinating as their wildlife is. But actually now we're recognizing how many benefits hedgerows bring us. There is growing interest in making sure they thrive into the future. We've got over 400,000 kilometers of hedgerow in this country, And by tweaking the way we manage this hedgerow network, as I've just explained, we have the potential to see rapid change, again, with little to no encroachment on the land, that area that feeds us. The infrastructure is there. We just need to make the most of it. We need to turn it back into the ecological dynamite that we know it really can be. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Megan. That was absolutely brilliant, and great to sort of end with all those resources as well. And I'll send a link to all those on the follow-up email, so everyone can find those really quickly and easily. Brilliant. Okay, so we've got plenty of time for questions. There are quite a few questions in the chat, Megan, so I'll just run through those, and then we'll open it up to anyone who wants to take themselves off mute and jump in with a question. So the first question was, what do you recommend is the minimum margin width?
Oh, it depends how you're going to manage your hedge. I think it depends what you're farming inside the fields as well. I mean, I think a nice sort of 3-meter margin is quite nice. I know that there are grants available to take that all the way up to 8 or 10 meters, and that's great. But I think it depends. Sorry, I'm not going to be able to give a straight answer for this one. It depends. I mean, down in Devon, our field sizes are so small that if you put a 10-meter margin in, you wouldn't be left with much field. So I think it depends, you know, how much hedge density you've got as well. I think the main thing is that the margins are managed well, that they don't see too much compaction, that the hedge is allowed to billow out slightly but then get reset. So things like blackthorn do this quite well, so they'll sort of encroach a little bit and then you take them back every few years. And so I think whatever size margin it is, I think the management of that's the most important. But I like to see, you know, 2 or 3 meters margin at least.
Thank you. Okay, next, a really fascinating question actually about whether hedges benefit from mycorrhizal symbiotic relationships, and if so, do we know what fungal species help the most?
Oh, almost certainly. Most plants do, I think. And it won't just be the shrubby plants in the hedge, but it'll also be the plants at the base of the hedge. I think it's something like 80% of our flower species have these symbiotic relationships with fungi. And interestingly, a lot of the time, if we add too many nutrients, that relationship gets broken. So if we put too many sort of fertilizers on land, this is, you know, why we call land without fertilizers unimproved land, why that's so valuable, because those connections with the mycorrhizal fungi and the roots of the flowers get broken. And if that happens, then the plants are much more vulnerable, because obviously fungi help gather micronutrients and water for plants. But almost certainly, and when you think things like the ancient hedgerows that I was talking about, you know, a hedgerow that's 1,000 years old, the soil underneath that hedgerow hasn't been disturbed for 1,000 years. And you know, think about the assart hedges; they were literally strips of ancient wildwood. So the soil profile under them are pretty much untouched. And when you think, well, that's got to have a massive impact in the diversity of the fungi that you'll find under there. You know, these could be, you know, little Noah's arks of fungi, just as network around our fields. So really very valuable on many fronts with the sort of soil and the fungi stuff.
And do we know what fungal species help the most, or do we just not know enough about?
I don't think we know enough. I mean, there's such a diversity of fungi, and we, you know, we know that there's, you know, millions of species that we haven't even found yet. So I wouldn't know where to start really, giving lists of them. There's so much.
Just actually a question that's just popped into my mind. When we're recreating hedgerows along the lines of ghost hedgerows that have been lost, do you know how long those mycorrhizal sort of relationships would persist in the soil? You know, if we put a hedgerow back along that previous hedgerow line, are we likely to still have those fungi in the soil, or do you think they will have been lost?
I think it will depend on a few factors. How long the hedgerow has been lost, a bit like you know, clearing away an ancient woodland doesn't mean the whole one's gone. You know, there's still all that stuff in the soil. It can be restored over time. I would say it depends how long it's been lost and how it's been treated in the meantime. If it has been ploughed and covered in you know, fungicide and herbicide and pesticide, then I think it would probably speed up the decline in those sort of communities, soil communities. So I don't think there's a simple answer to that one. It might be that there's some remnants there, but it depends what that strip of land has seen since.
Oh, thank you. Okay, next question. Why is it advisable to remove elder from the hedge?
This is an interesting one. So elder, there's a few things that elder does. So elder has this habit of finding a sort of a crack in a hedgerow, and it tends to grow a lot faster than the other hedgerow species. So what it does is it sort of turns that crack and it elbows space, turns it into a gap. And then elder, you know, it's not very stock proof, it's quite brittle, and it's not very long lived either, because it doesn't tolerate the trimming regimes of hedges. So it creates this sort of gap in the hedge, and then it dies, leaving a proper gap, and that's really frustrating. It also sort of releases some chemicals from its roots that sort of slows down the sort of, it sort of prevents other things growing in the soil around it, so it can sort of create gaps that way as well. But that's sort of a slower process. I would say it's not essential to remove all of it. I would say it's a really important indicator. If you see elder creeping into a hedge, you know that hedge might need a change of management, because elder only invades a hedge that has sort of cracks and little gaps appearing in it. So, you know, I don't like any plants to be demonized. Elder is a really fantastic plant for wildlife. It's got a place in our countryside. It's just, it happens to sometimes cause a little bit of damage in hedges. So if we change our mindset towards it and just use it as a handy indicator, wherever you see those sort of elder hummocks turning up in a hedge, it's just a sort of mental note to check up on the health of that hedgerow and make sure it doesn't need something else happening to it in the future, a change of management or something.
Great, thank you. Really good question, considering the amount of hedge planting that is now happening around the country. Is there a better alternative to the plastic spirals for whips?
Oh yes, this one, yeah. And completely, I mean, 45,000 miles of hedges, I did the math recently, equates to about 400 million plastic spirals, which is, you know, a huge amount. I think there's two things to think about. First of all, you know, is there an alternative? There are alternatives. The alternatives are a lot more expensive at the moment. So there are some companies making them out of sheep's wool, and I think that's fantastic. Sheep's wool obviously needs a good new outlet, because it's underutilized, but it's just more expensive. So far they don't get used as much. I think we also don't do the accounting of this very well, because if you accounted for the amount of time that it takes to put on a spiral guard, and the amount of time that it takes to take them off, and then the amount of time and money it takes to recycle them, then actually, you know, we might sort of go in the favor of the slightly more expensive ones that you don't have to remove. But so far that you know, it's a slow uptake. It's mostly still plastic that I'm seeing going out. In terms of if the plastic has gone out, how do we make sure it comes back in and it doesn't stay in the environment and cause, you know, microplastic pollution? I would say, again, with the hedge establishment methods I was mentioning, the one that my preferred method is, you know, you plant it, let it grow, you lay it, and then that's the perfect opportunity to take them off. The problem with other establishment methods is it doesn't give you that sort of deadline, that certain date to actually remove them. And taking plastic spiral guards off a young hedge is a really rubbish task, and it always falls down people's priorities list. There's always something more urgent to do than taking spiral guards off a hedge. So unless you've got that deadline of laying the hedge, or unless you've got that sort of incentive to do it, they tend to just stay there, and they do get brittle, and they do fall apart, and they do end up causing plastic pollution. So if they are out there, if they do get put out there in the hedges to protect them, and some protection is needed in a lot of parts of the country because we've got quite a lot of browsing animals, then we just need to make sure that we do actually take them back in before they degrade and start getting brittle and cracking and just falling apart.
Yeah, I know that CPRE Shropshire, through their Hedgerow Heroes project, they did some trials of planting without guards. They had conversations with the landowners about the rabbit situation on the land, and in some areas made the decision that they would trial not using any guards and accepting a certain level of loss, or maybe kind of over planting, assuming that you are going to lose a few stems per meter. So yeah, there are some alternative techniques, I suppose, as well as alternative guards.
Absolutely. And I think we have to do those measurements. If we were going to expect maybe 20% loss, I don't know at what level of loss is acceptable, because at the end of the day we've got to accommodate not only for the spiral guards but often for those little bamboo stakes as well. So there's a cost to putting them on, there's a cost to taking them off, and there's a cost to recycling them. At what level of loss of hedge stem to browsing does that counterbalance? I would say that a certain level of loss should be expected and absolutely fine. You can go back and replant those gaps, and in some ways you can do a few things to make it slightly better. So I think hedgerows are made better by scrambling climbing plants, things like dog roses and climbers. You actually wouldn't want to plant those when you plant the main hedge. So actually having a reason to go back and do some gap filling could be a good opportunity to plant those sort of climbing, scrambling plants that you want in your hedge.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next question is about dead hedges. So do you have any thoughts on dead hedges? We've used brush to infill gaps in our hedge.
I love dead hedges. I think they're great. It's a great use of brash, because at the end of the day, we don't want to be doing what they used to do, piling up the brash in the corner of a field and burning it. It has a much better value than that. So I think using it to fill gaps is fantastic. It maintains that connectivity, which is really good. Eventually it'd be nice to see those gaps filled, but sometimes those gaps might be in places that can't be filled. Things like hedges that have got thin under oak tree canopies. Well, you're not going to cut down the oak tree to make sure that you fill up the gap in the hedge, and no hedge planting is going to establish very well underneath the canopy of a full oak tree. So actually doing stuff like dead hedging in those situations is fantastic, because it's maintaining that connectivity. It's a fantastic use of brash. It will slowly degrade, be fantastic for invertebrates as well. I think they're brilliant. There can be a really good short-term connectivity patcher as well in places so where you might have to do some coppicing or hedge laying to rejuvenate a hedge. If you've done that in a situation and there was no other option, where that does break connectivity between two habitats, then actually utilizing that brash as a dead hedge can sort of maintain that connectivity whilst that rejuvenated hedge regrows.
Fantastic. Okay, a question on gapping up. So how best should I gap up? I tried gapping up, but the young whips got outcompeted. Should I trim back the adjacent mature plants or coppice them to give the whips in the gaps some space to grow?
Definitely. Definitely. And again, this is something that there hasn't been much good advice on, I don't think. I would also think, well, why has that hedge got a gap in the first place? So hedges get gaps for many reasons, but I think the most common reason that hedges get gappy is that the hedge plants themselves are stressed with the way that they're being managed, and gaps are often caused by the way that we've been managing them. So I would say it's also worth considering the rest of the hedge and looking at that. If it's got to a point where gaps are emerging, it might well be that the rest of the hedge needs rejuvenation as well, in which case it could be better, and I'm not, this isn't true for every scenario, but it's true for many, could be better to actually coppice or lay the entire hedge and fill the gap at that point of rejuvenation. That takes away some of that competition for light, and gives your whips a better chance of establishing. If your hedge is in perfect condition, it just happens to have a gap for some other unknown reason, then yes, I would say cutting back, coppicing back the hedge just directly either side of it is a really good method. But when you bring that hedge back up to establishment, that gap, it's best to raise it. So again, do that incremental trimming with the coppice stuff either side, rather than letting it grow up to the height you want it. So again, it needs to have that establishment technique to really develop that structure again.
Okay, thank you. Okay, a question here. Should the 97 Act, and I'm guessing that's the Hedgerow Regulations Act, be revised to provide protection to a greater range of hedges?
I think it could be expanded, definitely. In fact, I think it could be expanded in many ways. I think it would be really interesting because this development is probably one of the areas that I would like to see this expanded. At the moment, if planning permission is given on a piece of land, then that trumps the hedge regs 97. So the hedgerow regulations are no longer a thing. I would like to see the hedgerow regulations, and the hedgerow regulations mean that the age and the importance and the diversity value of your hedge is taken into account before permission is given for removal. Obviously, that doesn't have to be taken into account to get planning permission. So to me, that's an area that could be addressed. As to whether a greater range of hedges should come under it, I think so. I think hedges need protection, because it's not just hedges that have 7 species per 30 meters that actually need this, or architectural features. Actually, we need to be making sure that there is a justifiable reason to remove any hedge. I'm not saying no hedge should ever be removed again, but I do think we need to really stop and think, are we justified in removing this hedge? So I think there could be some expansion here, especially I think local distinctiveness needs to be taken into account as well, and the local context really should be considered.
Thank you. Oh, a question to me actually. How successful was the trial of no plastic spiral guards? I don't know. I don't know if those hedgerows have been revisited this year to see how many made it through the first year. I'm sure Sarah Jameson, who runs the Hedgerow Heroes project for CPRE Shropshire, might know the answer to that. So I will maybe ask her if it's okay to pop her contacts in the follow-up email, and anyone who's interested in finding out about their project or asking that question can get in touch with her. Okay, another question. How can I persuade my local farmers to change the way they manage their hedges?
Oh, this is a difficult one. Because certainly I wouldn't recommend going up to them and knocking on their door and telling them they're doing it wrong. The farmers have a huge amount of things to consider when it comes to how they manage their land, and it's really difficult to know how to approach this. At the moment, what we're doing as a charity, as an organisation, is helping make sure our considerations about what we think good hedgerow management for wildlife looks like are taken into account when these new farming incentives are being designed. And I'm hoping that those farming incentives are going to be enough to persuade local farmers to take them up and manage their hedgerows differently. Certainly, the government have been increasing the rates for things like hedge laying and gapping up and hedge planting, and that does seem to have been making a difference. Other than that, I go around the country all winter talking to farm cluster groups, going on nice wintry walks around their farms and looking at different hedge structures and looking at different approaches. But I think it's difficult, because I think we need farmers to come to this. It's difficult to take it to them. You know, it needs to be a two-way street. They need to sort of want to know more about their hedges. So certainly don't go up to your local, you know, don't just knock on your local farmer's door and tell them that they've been doing it wrong, because I think they've probably got quite a lot of that over the years. And I think there's better ways. So really, at the end of the day, I'm not sure how to answer that question. I don't know how, as an individual, we can influence this, other than sharing best practice and what we think. I genuinely think carrots are better than sticks. I encourage all the farmers that I know that do a brilliant job in hedge management to just share what they're doing, share photos on social media, and celebrate the good management that they're doing, because I genuinely think that positive peer pressure is much more influential than criticism. So yeah, that's my two pence on that one.
Yeah, I totally agree with that last point. Many of you will know that through Stepping Stones, we work with the Upper Oni Farmers Group, and many of those farmers are doing some great work around hedgerow restoration. You know, I'm planting on a couple of farmers' holdings over the next couple of years, about 5 kilometres of hedgerow, you know, and they're very keen, very enthusiastic. And I think, you know, those farmers are the best ambassadors for you know, hedgerow restoration and a good hedgerow management. Okay, so we've got about 5 minutes left, so we can squeeze in a few more questions. I think we've got one more question in the chat, which is about garden hedges, actually, and whether garden hedges can play a significant part for wildlife.
Oh, definitely. Gardens are another one of those sort of woodland edge ecotones, or they can be. They'll have, you know, often grass and pasture. They'll have flowering and fruiting shrubs, and often trees as well. And having hedges in gardens are just as good. You know, the management of garden hedges might be slightly more constrained depending on how big your garden is, but they do all the same things. They might at times be acting as stepping stones rather than corridors, like they would be around fields, but actually, you know, still incredibly valuable for wildlife. We can have a little bit more flexibility with them as well. I think garden hedges you can have a bit of fun with, and plant species that you might not necessarily put in your field boundary hedges. So I like to put lots of food in garden hedges because I'm a glutton. So I, you know, put sort of things like red currant bushes or black currant bushes and apple trees and things that actually, you know, give that hedge more value for us, really, and also for wildlife. Because I think as soon as we value something as a human, we tend to treat it better. And you know, I think the same goes with rural hedges. You know, if that hedge is being managed to produce enough food that you can forage from, then there's also going to be all sorts of pollinators and birds and mammals that will benefit from that as well.
Okay, thank you. That's all the questions that were in the chat. I don't know if anyone else has a question and they want to take themselves off mute and ask their question directly. No.
I would just like to say, sorry, just a quick one. Only just going on from the variety of species in hedgerows. Is there a sort of a standard, like however many hawthorn, blackthorn, hazel? How would you have more hawthorn, less hazel? The variety, I know. Megan was very keen to talk about variety for berries, obviously, but I was just wondering, should there be more of one and less of another kind of thing?
I would say go for a big mix. Get as many species as you can and want to get in there, that's sort of locally appropriate. I would say always go for native species where you can, but a big mix. I think I think depending on what you want your hedgerow to be for, whenever we're planting a hedgerow, we're in the unique situation that we can design it from scratch. We haven't just, inherited them like we have with most of our hedges. So we can work out what we want that hedgerow to be for. Now, if it's for wildlife, I would say as many species as you can fit in, and try and give it a good, we call it a blossom sequence. So you want to make sure that you start, with the blackthorn flowers, and then the cherry plum, and then making sure that there's not too much of a gap in that sort of blossom period. And that translates quite well to the fruiting sequence as well. So you've got a nice big chunk of time where you've got fruit continuously through. But it depends what we're wanting that hedge for. So that's for wildlife. I mean, some people might want to be planting their hedge for privacy reasons, and I'd say, go for hedges that retain some foliage. So things like holly, beech and oak both retain leaves when they're trimmed under that sort of circumstance. So for garden hedges, they're quite good. And how we want to manage that hedge, I think, going forward as well. And it has an implication on what we put in it. But certainly, there's no reason to plant single species hedgerows anymore. I think hawthorn is fantastic, but the only reason we've got all of these hawthorn dominant hedges is because it was easy to get them, and that it was done during a time where we just planted hedges as fast as we can. So we don't have to do that anymore. I would say as big a mix as you can, and is locally appropriate, really.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
And in the follow-up email, I'm certainly happy to share the species mix that we're going to put in this winter at Barnes Farm. As Megan said, it's sometimes horses for courses, depending on the landscape that you're putting it in. But yeah, I'm happy to send that as an example. Okay, any more questions?
Do you think that hedgerows, you might have answered this actually, in and of themselves are sufficient to support populations of dormouse, even if they don't have connections locally to other habitats like woodland or scrub?
Yes, definitely. We see breeding nests in them, so we know they're there for full breeding cycles, so supporting breeding populations. There's a lot that we don't know about dormice in hedgerows, so there's a lot that I'm keen to find out, and we're actually running another survey called it's the National Footprint Tunnel in Hedgerows survey, where we're looking at the condition of hedgerows and the species composition of hedgerows alongside footprint tunnels to understand a little bit more about what kinds of hedgerows are used most by dormice and which ones are most valuable. So the structure, the size, the species composition, the management type that it's seeing, that sort of thing. Because again, there's a lot that we still don't know that we really do need to know. I mean, we've got 45,000 miles of hedging going in before 2050, so we want to make sure that we get the right kind of hedging going in. But yes, I think they can support breeding populations even without being connected to coppice woodland. But we're still really just finding out the extent to which that's happening. Most of the monitoring that we do with dormice is in woodlands, because that's the methodology we've got. We use nest boxes, but of course nest boxes don't really work in hedgerows. So hedgerows have been under monitored, and it's only really now that we understand how well things like footprint tunnels and nest tubes work, that we're actually getting a better understanding of how well utilised hedges are.
Thank you. More on that next Saturday at the National Dormouse Conference.
Oh yeah, I'll see you there.
Great. Well, we're just past 8:30, so I think we will wrap things up here. Megan, thank you so much. I don't know if you can see all the comments coming through in the chat, but so many people are just saying brilliant talk. Thank you, and really informative and interesting. And yeah, I echo that. So yeah, thanks so much for giving up your evening to speak to us tonight.
No, it's
and
a
thank
pleasure.
you everyone for joining us. Great to have so many people sort of engaged and interested in hedges. As I said, I'll send a follow-up email that'll have a ton of information and various links and links to things that Megan talked about in her talk. So look out for that in the next few days. I'll also send a link to the recording of this, so if you want to watch it back or to check any of the things that Megan said, or you know, watch it again, then I'll send that in the email. Okay. Thank you again, Megan. It's been absolutely brilliant evening, and hope to see you all soon with a spade in hand at some of the planting sessions this winter.
Brilliant. Thank you all for listening.